And another thing is, it's easy to use international law as an excuse as to why you're abstaining from admitting that you've committed egregious crimes against humanity. But what we're not going to do is forget. So buckle up, go fetch your attention span, because I brought this one along so that I can remind you of the receipts. Because there is a version of history that Britain would prefer people to believe. A version where the slave trade was something that happened far, committed by the Portuguese or the Spanish, the people who came before. So let's start with a man called Richard Hakluyt. In his work, Principal Navigations, Hakluyt made an urgent appeal to Protestant England at the time, alarming them of the fact that Spain has made a formidable head start in Africa. And his message was simple: get in the game or be left behind. And that's where this story starts, with competition and greed. The commodity that tied the British Isles to the complete fate of enslaved Africans is sugar. When English settlers found their way to the smaller islands of the Caribbean, Barbados, St. Kitts, they discovered that sugarcane was more profitable than anything that they've ever grown. But sugar needed bodies. And at first they used indentured servants, poor men and women from Britain and Ireland, bound to years of brutal labor in exchange for passage and promises. But as that supply dried up very quickly after the English Civil War, the planters of Barbados went somewhere else, to Africa. By 1680, there were 38,000 enslaved Africans on the island of Barbados alone. And by the end of the century, 50,000 on one island. Because Europeans decided that sugar is worth a lot more than life. And to manage this new reality that they've created, the English did something deliberate. They wrote that into the law. In 1661, the Barbados Assembly passed the Barbados Slave Code. And this was a legal system built from the ground up to dehumanize African people. The code specifically describes them as heathenish, brutish, and of a certain dangerous pride. And that language was necessary because if you are going to mutilate people's faces, brand their cheeks, castrate them, work them to death, you first have to convince yourself and everyone around you that they are not fully human. And here's the irony. White indentured servants, despite all of the abuse that they endured, still had the protection of English common law. They still had the right to a trial by jury, something black people didn't have. And you know what? The category of white as a racial identity had to be explained to these newly arriving Europeans because it was a foreign term. Yet now, it's a new identity formed on the plantations of Barbados. English plantation owners took people from across Europe, Britain, Ireland, Scotland, poor English laborers, people who never thought of themselves as sharing an identity, and collapsed them into a single category: white. Why? For insurance. So they manufactured racial solidarity amongst whites, giving the white poor just enough status to make them feel that they have something to protect. Race, as we understand it today, was a business. Now let's talk about the institution that formalized all of this. In 1672, King Charles II established the Royal African Company. You've heard of them before. And this was the British Crown, with the King's own brother, the Duke of York, as a key stakeholder. The Royal African Company was responsible for transporting and enslaving more Africans than any other company in the British history. Over the course of its existence, it dispatched into slavery around 150 African men, women, and children. And within a single decade of its formation, Britain's share of the Atlantic slave trade grew from just 33% to 74%. They dominated. And then, when independent English merchants were locked out of the Royal African Company's monopoly, they launched a political campaign. They argued that access to the slave trade was a natural right of all Englishmen. Remember that. They called the RAC, or the Royal African Company, the African monster. And they framed the right to enslaved African people as a defining feature of English freedom. And in the same breath, they spoke of their liberty, arguing for the right to strip millions of others of theirs entirely. And they won. In 1712, the monopoly was broken. The trade was privatized and deregulated, and it exploded. The merchants of Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow enriched themselves and their cities beyond imagination. The plantation owners came back to Britain, dripping in this new money, buying up land, marrying into the aristocracy, the grand buildings you walk past in Bristol, the docks of Liverpool, the country estates, the institutions, many of them carrying the fingerprints of this trade, even if the plaques on the walls choose not to say so. And if you forget everything you've heard today, because this was a long video, just remember this. Britain constructed the empire legally, deliberately, and systematically, and on the labor of enslaved African people, and the wealth generated from that same system generated this modern world. But payback is knocking on its door.